What have you seen, Ben, among maybe your customers throughout Asia Pacific in terms of the workloads that they've experienced throughout the pandemic? Has there been a massive upsurge, or how's it? What's it looking like?
I think the first couple of months, earlier in the year, around that kind of March and April timeframe, when most countries in the world were sort of going into some form of lockdown, particularly for workplaces, there was definitely like a massive surge, particularly around VDI, and being able to publish what were sort of previously, again, a lot of internal applications that weren't exposed over the internet or through any form of remote access. And so that also kind of brought into line things like single sign-on and pre-authentication and all the kind of mechanisms to try and bring some layers of security and secure access to those. So we definitely saw that big surge, with both existing customers and new customers, with the increased demand on them. Probably more so in support and services than in sales, because again, a lot of that was like whatever you've got, people are just trying to use whatever they got and piece it together to get as much online as they can. I'd say that's calmed down now, and now people are really looking, I guess, more like they've done a post-mortem on how poorly or well that period went for them, and looking to make more strategic improvements and investments, for the longer term, and to put those pieces together in a more deliberate way. And so we're having much more kind of transformation, long-term strategic kind of discussions now with customers, both new and existing, kind of looking to adapt how their infrastructure works.
Excellent. Vic, what have you seen from your side? I mean, I'm sure we'll get into the details once we really get into the conversation proper, but just, off the top of your head.
Well, in terms of the applications, I agree with Ben, but the good thing is that there was only a fair few applications where we could not access them remotely, or we didn't deploy them remotely because they were desktop applications. I think predominantly you'll see there's the old desktop legacy applications that are problem childs to be deployed as VDIs or to be deployed in a remote environment like Citrix or whatnot. And we did have quite a few of them sitting in one of our Citrix environments, but we didn't know how they were going to behave if they were installed as a client on one or two servers, when all the users are trying to use the client and the underlying data at the same time. Because usually people have the client on their desktops and they're only extracting data over the local LAN. But now you've got the application on the same server, on the same VDI that's also trying to get the data. It becomes a different story. And it's being shared by multiple people at the same time. Saying that, it was easy to scale. Thankfully, there weren't that many applications that required that sort of massaging, but we were able to sort of isolate them to different VDIs where we knew a certain bunch of people, a certain group of functional users were the only ones using those applications. We were able to isolate them to a VDI that wasn't affecting the primary VDI, where all the other users are using common applications among themselves. So that's something that worked really well for us. That was a bit of a challenge. As Ben said, the legacy, mostly desktop or legacy applications, web applications, you don't have to worry about them. You can open a port and away you go. Put a load balancer in front of it. That's the easiest. That's why I think us moving a long time ago, we decided to predominantly work on web applications in-house, and that's what we do. And that saved our bacon because that was the easiest thing to move over to when you're actually working from home. And especially when you've got, online email access, you've got your desktop, you've got your Citrix if you want file folders. So, it all comes in together. As I said, it's the old desktop legacy applications. And a lot of them applications, like accounting software, you can't make them fully web-based, you know what I mean? There's a lot of processing power behind it, treasury software, so it has to be desktop-based. But there was a few other things we did, which I'm happy to talk during a conversation, which made life easier. And the answer to that is VPN. So we allowed the users to have the application installed on their home computers and set up a tunnel, so that way the application itself is using the local resources, but the actual data connection is going back to the network, and basically it's just extracting the data.
Brilliant, brilliant. Vic, let me just stop you right there because we are absolutely about to begin. So, just hold your thought over there and we'll come back to that during the Q&A. Um, so welcome everyone. We have officially started. I'm Rahul. I'm the head of content at Jicara Media, and welcome to this workshop on stabilizing critical IT services. I have with me today Benjamin Hodge, who's the principal technical advisor at Kemp. And I also have Vic Sharma with me, who is the head of IT at Balmain Corporation. So welcome both of you. Welcome to the attendees. So before we sort of really get into the meat of it, I just want to, I'm sitting in my house moderating a workshop across APAC, and if someone had told me that a year ago or something, I would not have believed it. But here we are. I think we've seen unprecedented times over the past 4 or 5 months. In terms of the consumer side as well as the enterprise side, we've seen workloads that are never seen before. I think I saw a survey where it said that more than half the enterprises in Asia Pacific have seen loads that they have never seen before 2020. And that's not just organic growth. That is basically the pandemic showing itself in the most unlikely circumstances. So I think one of the consequences has been that IT has had to not only deal with its internal issues and organization. Some people working from home, some people working remotely, some people stuck in different countries, but they've had to also service the internal applications, the HR, the ERPs, etc., as well as the customer-facing applications. So it's been a triple whammy in a sense for the IT staff. So I think today's workshop really is going to try to demystify what happens when you see unprecedented workloads, unprecedented access, and application slows down. If it fails, what are some of the remedial steps you can take? So with that, maybe what I'll do is I'll pass it over to Ben for a brief introduction to Kemp as well as what he does at Kemp. So Ben, you want to start?
Sure. Thanks, Rahul. And yeah, thanks everybody for joining us today. So yeah, my name's Benjamin Hodge. Been at Kemp for quite a while, currently as the principal technical advisor under the office of the CTO and within the R&D organization. Also the author of Application Experience, which focuses on helping IT leaders understand and plan and manage digital transformation with their organizations. So yeah, excited today to kind of maybe focus a little bit on some ways of thinking about the limited resources and infinite workload that a lot of people are facing right now, and hopefully give you some ways to think about that, or some tools to think about.
Excellent. Thanks, Ben. Vic, maybe a brief introduction of what you do as well as Balmain.
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Vic Sharma. I'm the head of IT for Balmain NB Corporation. We're a financial services organization in Sydney, Australia. Corporate head office in Sydney, Australia. We're based all around the eastern seaboard. I manage the development, the infrastructure, the WAN, the LAN, and pretty much the whole IT infrastructure for Balmain Corporation, which constitutes a lot of other businesses within the environment as well. I've been here for 15 years. I feel part of the furniture now. Yeah, so it's basically my responsibility and my job to make sure the entire organizational infrastructure is at par with what's required. The requirements in terms of security, the high availability, the connectivity back, especially with the COVID stuff, and to make sure the organization's been up and running since the start of the pandemic.
Excellent. Very good, Vic. Thank you. So just a couple of housekeeping things as we go on. So we are in the welcome and opening remarks. We'll soon head into the fireside chat, after which we'll have the deep dive workshop session, and then we'll have the audience Q&A and closing remarks. So actually, when it comes to the audience Q&A, I'm not sure if we'll have the time to go into verbal and audio Q&A. So if the audience members, if you guys have any questions at all, you can just put it into the Q&A box at the top of your, if you can see in your Zoom panel, there's a Q&A section. So you can ask an anonymous question. You can ask a question at any time during the entire session, and we'll try to get to it either during the session or at the end during the Q&A. So with that, maybe what we can do is we can really sort of get into the initial fireside chat. So maybe a general question for both of you, which is what are some of the challenges enterprise digital platforms face during these unprecedented times? And what are the typical experiences of the IT staff during this time with the increased workload? So maybe Ben, you want to take that first?
Sure. I mean, we maybe in the pre-opening when we were chatting a bit, we kind of talked about, that was obviously this year, earlier in the year, some very reactionary kind of activity. For most people, that's past. And I think now the big thing that people are faced with is, again, depending where you are, potentially very long periods of time with your workforce remote, or uncertainty about offices closing, opening, and so on. Like, for example, I mean, we have offices in India and Ireland, which are both quite badly affected and have very strict workplace regulations. And I think multiple times now, the day before reopening the office, the governments have again said, no, we're extending the lockdown. And we've gone through that cycle maybe 4 or 5 times of expecting it to come back or not. In Australia, we've seen cities like Melbourne open back up only to kind of close in even stricter conditions than they were originally. So that level of uncertainty, we're seeing all kinds of strategies companies are bringing to that, whether they're saying, look, we're not opening ever again, right? At one extreme, we're going to keep it this way. We're going to at least commit to a year remote, or people trying to adapt based on the latest kind of conditions. It just brings a huge amount of uncertainty to the business about what is required, and that flows through to IT. And so I think what people really are trying to think about now is that longer term, how do we get visibility on the work? How do we keep making decisions? How do we keep solving complex problems and collaborating? And what blockers and friction do we have in our IT systems that are going to hold us back from adapting to that? So I think this is where people are starting to shift into a much more strategic phase of really going right back to basics and looking what is or isn't fit for purpose. And then that likewise brings a lot of questions about prioritization, limits in resources, limits in budgets, again, if the business is financially hurting, and a lot of complexity in the execution of how to achieve those goals.
Excellent. Vic, your experience mirrors that?
Yeah, pretty much does. I think one of the things, the first challenge, I think, and a lot of people in this webinar today would have experienced the same as us. The 2 biggest challenges from a digital perspective was how to make remote working and collaboration work seamlessly from home, which was the biggest challenge for any organization, including us. For me and my team, the biggest challenge also was a lot of people were not used to working from home. I mean, we had users that didn't even have internet at home, which was pretty shocking, but they didn't. A lot of them, even though they probably decided they never wanted internet, they were tethering off their phones. So all of a sudden, they don't have equipment at home, they don't have the remote tools, they don't have laptops, or they don't have the desk. So we had to make sure the problem is not to just cover the aspects of the environment that you have within your network, which is in the office, but it's also how they connect to that network. So you can offer all the remote tools and connectivities and collaboration stuff, but if they don't have the right equipment, it's not going to work. For example, they need to have, at base, they need to have an internet. Some people didn't have that. So we had to think about how we're going to provide internet to them. Then some people didn't have any desktop or laptop computers. They didn't have the right tools to connect. So, and also bringing that whole situation of, okay, now that you're working from home, how can we make it so seamless that it was the exact same way if you were at work? Because, talking to people, obviously sharing files, sharing information, that collaboration, the chatter between people, how do we make it very seamless? That was the biggest challenge for us. And thankfully we had a few things in place, like we had collaboration tools that we could use. We got in Australia, for example, a lot of companies were throwing a lot of free trials. Cisco WebEx did a free trial for 90 days for companies. So we used a lot of that technology as well to help users out where we couldn't assist them with things they already had. So the biggest challenge was obviously making sure the remote connectivity is there. The work from home environment is seamless as it would have been if they were in the office, and they can still collaborate information as if they were, again, in the workplace environment, a normal workplace environment.
Excellent. That's a very good point, because it brings me to the second question, which is, obviously we've talked about the experience of the employees, um, but going back to the IT side in a sense. So obviously employees are, scrambling to get internet, trying to make sure that they are, logged into the HR systems or whatever else it may be. How does IT now make sure that these systems are available 24/7, anytime, anywhere, in any sort of device or format? Because it used to be that it was a very sort of disciplined access, right? You had access during work hours. You had it was very predictable time before the pandemic. But now it's like IT has to basically make it available to everyone all the time, on any device. So how has that IT experience been? Maybe Vic, you wanna start first, maybe on that one.
Well, it feels like a 7-Eleven now, to be honest, because before there was still a time where you could relax and you knew there was a working hours, or you had people scheduled during certain working hours to do certain things, or you had a roster. Since the pandemic, there hasn't been such thing as a roster. I mean, me and my team have been working crazy hours. The first 2 weeks were the worst, I think, for everyone, to just make everyone make sure they can work from home, realizing that we had to scale out or scale up, realizing, we needed more juice in the systems. We needed to deploy certain applications that we thought were remote savvy, but not. So there was a lot of challenges in the beginning to sort of mitigate those issues. But I think what's happened is, as time has gone by, we realized as long as the application is available now 24/7, as I said, 7-Eleven, that's what really is important, because a lot of people now are working in different environments, from different places. In a lot of countries, they still have kids at home, which makes it harder to work during normal business hours. So they wait till the kids go to bed and they work overnight, or they keep working through the night, early hours in the morning. So there's no such concept of 9 to 5, so to speak. That's gone. That's long gone. It has to be available 24/7. Support has to be available there 24/7 as well, which means the IT department has to make sure that they have full control over the availability of the IT infrastructure. So if something goes down, there's any alerts about systems not being available, somebody needs to jump on it straight away. Because there could be anyone in any part of the world. Obviously, if they're traveling, again, if they're stuck in another part of the world, that's happened a lot. They could be logging on at non-Sydney time or non-Australian time. So you know what I mean? So you can't just say we're going to have monitoring systems only monitor for this number of hours and keep an eye on that. No, it's now 24/7. So that's so that the availability has become a very important factor, including making sure you can scale up and scale out if there's more resources required at the same time.
Excellent. Ben, your experience has been similar, and those of your customers?
Yeah, I mean, even if I reflect within the R&D organization, so sort of more internally, like for myself and the teams I work with, as well as with customers, I think the biggest thing that we've really been focusing on, because we were already fairly distributed, and we were, everything essentially kind of was accessible remotely. We had a lot of customers, particularly in like universities and education or government, where that certainly wasn't the case. They had little or no kind of remote access, and it was a bigger shift for them. And then obviously people like Vic that were pretty primed, pretty ready, and it was kind of just picking up those pieces that you could never have foreseen. But the big thing that I think really challenged people, and probably still is, if they haven't got mechanisms to cope, is, and Vic alluded to it a little bit, but in his other comments, but how do you make decisions? How do you do activities like a deep dive technical design workshop that you would typically get people all in a room for 3 days? How do you, or a large leadership, how do you keep making decisions, big decisions, sometimes very hard decisions? How do you keep that happening? How do you keep that flowing? So you can adapt, whether that's within your team or kind of like more across departments and across the organization. And also a big shift, I think, you kind of hear a lot of stuff about mental health, but the big shift you really see is, you have people that are very extroverted, people that are really driven by the energy of the office, the chatter, the energy in the kitchen, bumping into people, that kind of stuff. And then you get the sort of more introverted people that they like to be in their own headspace and their own kind of corner and quiet. They don't really enjoy that kind of office, or it's very draining in the office for them. You've seen this total flip in sort of the energy of people, right? People that were really driven by that office environment now are really struggling, right? Particularly if they live alone, they've been locked in their apartment, maybe for weeks. And then other people, we had one senior developer, his first comment was, "You'll never see me ever again. This is the best thing that's ever happened," right? Because he could sit in his space, in his place, thinking all day and really focusing. So really understanding that shift in people, because the office was always the status quo, people who are going to thrive at home and the mental state of different people in your team could have shifted very dramatically over the last few months. That was a big thing to really cope with and work out how to support people as well.
And actually, just to add to that, Ben, I totally agree with you. That's a really good point to bring up about mental health. And that we experienced, myself personally, I spoke to a lot of people during the lockdown, and they were talking about, they were predominantly worried about, and I think a lot of companies, including yourselves, will be going through, most of the times I used to get that question right in the end, these sneaker questions saying, are we going to have a job at the end of it? Like, what do you think is happening? That unknown, the fear unknown, because people all over the world were losing jobs, and they didn't know what was going on. So that you always used to, they're trying to ask any senior manager that they can get their hands on over the, obviously, chatter or phone, my job, okay. So everyone was worried about the job. So there was an extra level of stress apart from just being isolated. Always like, will I have a job next week? Because unfortunately, a lot of people have lost their jobs because of this pandemic. On top of that, just bringing this into perspective of IT. So our job was also to make sure people were comfortable at the same time. So if somebody wanted a better computer, a better laptop, a better internet connection, we as a company decide we're just going to give it to them. We're going to make them feel as much happy and as unisolated that we can, so they know that the company is right behind them. Because that's a very big factor when people are isolated, because they don't know what's happening in the corporate world and what strategy meeting, what chit chat's going on in the backgrounds. But as long as you keep in touch with them, you make sure they've got the IT support they need, they've got the IT equipment, they've got the backing. If there's any issues, they can reach out to someone. I think that helps a lot. It really, really encourages them to feel like they still belong as part of the corporate family.
Yeah, the psychological aspect is something that is seldom talked about. I think everyone kind of assumes that IT is full of robots. It's not quite there yet, but it's going to get there. And we got Skynet coming up soon. So before then, you really got to take care of the mental health of a lot of employees. Very true. So with that, I think we could go on with this for quite a while. But I think maybe what we'll do is we'll start on the workshop proper. I have a bunch of questions that I guess I'll reserve for the workshop itself. So if all the attendees can go to the chat, I think Ben will be sharing his slides from now on. But if everyone can go to the chat, I have put in there a link to the workshop sheet, the worksheet. So you guys can actually access that from my Google Drive, and you can download that to your desktop as well.
And Rahul, I need you to give me sharing permissions. We didn't check that before.
Okay.
Thanks.
Hang on.
Technical difficulties.
Yep. How exactly do I?
Just go into participants and right click on me, and it should be like more or menu where you can give me.
Let me Okay, you
Great.
should be able to.
Yep. Yeah, I got it. Thank you. Okay. And I will let's put this into the, I might just
Excellent.
minimize that so everyone's not looking at a reflection back. So when Rahul first kind of suggested this concept and was asking me about what could we do, again, looking at the form of something that's higher value than just a kind of one-way communication and bring more of a virtual workshop approach. And obviously, we have a fairly limited amount of time, although investing an hour and a half is quite a lot. If you think about it from a workshop perspective, it's hard to go too deep on too many things there. One of the things that I really reflected on was that pressure to do, a lot more than you've ever been asked to do with, if anything, maybe even less than you had before. Maybe you've already had a round of layoffs or you've had hiring freezes or other things. And really about how do you maximize the business impact of what you're able to achieve? How do you prepare to adapt to changing requests and requirements as the business itself tries to adapt? And one of the biggest things in that is, people often struggle with is they're already at maximum capacity. Without anything new, people would have been busy before this happened. People were already, under pressure. So a lot of it is about how to kind of really focus and maximize the impact of your existing resources, your existing investments in technology, and how to do that and think about that. So that was really some of the things I thought about in trying to prepare this. And like I said, share some thinking models and some ideas that will help you kind of work out where to focus and maybe, some simple changes and techniques. And, we kind of see this constant and relentless progress in IT operations and pace, and whether you're talking about things like, how often deployments happen, how many, changes are able to be rolled out successfully, time to resolution, pretty much any kind of operational metric. The gap between kind of elite and low performing organizations is just sort of really gaining ground. And that, again, keeps putting more and more pressure on teams around continuous improvement, but also stakeholders' expectations are going up, sometimes unreasonably, right, for the level of resourcing and outcomes they're expecting from what they're investing. So this is sort of something, again, that just puts pressure, any kind of solution that says, here's 100 new pieces of technology or software you need triple the budget, you need different people, you need more people, whatever that is, that's not, basically, it's not helpful. There's nothing you can do in these kind of short time frames that you're going to be able to kind of impact that. So when we look at, the goals for like a modern IT organization, it's really about, and Vic, you touched on this a bit, the application experience. What is the experience for both the users in terms of how they're interacting with the digital systems, but also what's the experience in, operating them, right? What's the experience for your teams? What's the experience for stakeholders in what they see they're getting out of the organization? And, like almost anything, it's a balance of multiple factors, and particularly around how we bring people, process, and technology together to drive that impact. And so the focus I really wanted to take for today was around process. It's highly unlikely that you're going to be able to, magically make your people into different people or double the size of your workforce. But it's also probably unlikely that you need to, right? And unless you're in a highly dysfunctional organization, and I hope no one here today is in that seat. Likewise with your technology, we're often faced with all kinds of messages about the latest technology we need, changing to a different approach or a different system or upgrading to another licensing tier. But again, there's a lot of things that you're already invested in there's a lot of technologies that are very well understood, very commonly available, that can have a huge impact if you make the most of it out of them. So I really wanted to kind of take that, I guess, that positive approach, that, and if that's the only thing people get out of today, that, you know, you do have the right people, you do have the right technologies, and with some simple kind of process enhancements or tweaks, you know, you can really turn around some of the big things that you need to get yourself that breathing room to start thinking longer term and reinvesting those resources elsewhere. That's what I'd really like for people to get out of today.
Sorry, Ben, just to interrupt you, and I'll keep doing this throughout the workshop. But would you say that the sort of a defining difference between a high-performing organization and a not so well-performing organization is basically the process circle? Is that where they really differentiate from each other?
I mean, you can kind of take it from any angle. I mean, it is a holistic thing. I mean, process can only take you so far, but these are kind of interdependent things, and you know, often it is. Well, you might not be able to change the individual people, or hard skills might take time to change. You can change mindset, how people think about their job, how they think about their role, what they think success looks like. That can have a big impact, and again, lead to processes. But these things need to be in balance, and putting the right processes in place does not guarantee success, but having the wrong processes in place does guarantee failure. And that's, I think, the key thing, is that no matter how good your people are, how good your technology is, if you don't have effective processes that are really focused on removing hurdles to kind of value creation, then, you know, those investments will not have the impact that you need them to have. So it's a very big part. And obviously it's usually one of the easiest things to change, providing you're in the right seat and you have the right kind of support and authority. But even on a team level, there's often little things you can do.
And Ben, I think that comes down to strategic planning as well. The more you plan, the more you test, the more you revisit your strategy to make sure it aligns with the current environment. That helps as well. That eventuates that possibility of making sure you're always in line with what's best at now rather than what was best 6 months ago. And, you know, I also say a couple of weeks ago, I mentioned to someone that before there used to be something called plan B. I think we've all learned the lesson. There's no such thing called a plan B anymore. There's a plan C, then there's a plan D, then there's plan E. There's been so many different plans because of the rush. And one thing the pandemic has brought is a lot of panic. You know, it's synonym of each other, pandemic panic. So people panic, they make quick decisions, they don't evaluate the decisions, they put things in place, especially applications or systems, then they realize, oh God, that's not the solution. But because everyone is in panic to get everyone access to whatever systems or whatever applications or whatever environment they wanted, they just went on a buying spree and they just bought all this software and hardware, not realizing how complicated it would be to install it or to maintain it, whether it even does the job for them. The first thing, they just Google whatever they could find and just buy it. And I think you're right on the mark. I think if you just, you know, during the pandemic, a lot of people would learn, if you're just patient and you visit your strategy and you just plan it properly, I think that will also improve your experience of your future application delivery and future application availability at the same time.
Yeah, I agree, Vic. And I think that a lot of it is, you know, just fundamentals, right? And really focusing on the impact, you know, rather than, like you said, fixating on whatever the latest technology fad or trend is. If you don't understand the impact you're trying to achieve, you can't. It's more about what's appropriate. There's no good or bad technology, just like there's no good or bad process necessarily. There's just appropriate process and inappropriate process. What people usually complain about process is just it's inappropriate for the situation and what they need to achieve. But in another circumstance, typically another point in time, like you said, it was perfectly appropriate, but then it stagnated and it was never, you know, brought in line as the situation changed. So,
yeah, absolutely.
So just to kind of understand, I kind of broke the agenda into two parts. And The first is assessing your applications. And I think focusing on the applications is a key thing, even if you're accountable for infrastructure. And the reason I say that is infrastructure is, again, a very internal facing thing. I guess even if your team, just say down on a team level rather than organizational level, even if your team was responsible for publishing some kind of, say, VDI or Hyper-V platform, VMware, some kind of hypervisor platform that was consumed by another IT group, right? So in essence, your customers or users are also within IT, or although that might be classified as infrastructure, that's a kind of application that they consume, and you can use the same kind of tooling and thinking and mindset. But if we go a bit kind of bigger picture and think of from an organizational level or departmental level and kind of leadership position, looking at ways that you can really have a quick smoke test or sanity check on, are there any applications that are at risk potentially because of the way they are being operated or managed, right? So we'll kind of go through a thought process, and this will be a very quick, like I said, very quick sanity check kind of process, and that's in the document that Rahul shared. But I'll also share, there's a couple of deeper, more detailed frameworks that I discuss in my book, and that I've tried to synthesize a little bit because they can take a little while to get going. But we'll work through that and talk about how to kind of find certain patterns or anti-patterns that might give you hints on where some pain is coming from for certain applications, and ways of managing or operating them that might help you remove them. And the whole goal of that is then to free up resources to reinvest elsewhere, particularly in strategic improvements. And then the second part of it is really looking at, well, once you're already in that bad place, once you're already in that place where particularly a critical application is almost unmanageable, it's unstable, it's constantly, causing fires, it's constantly sucking up resources, it's constantly receiving complaints and putting pressure on you from stakeholders. Again, how do you contain that? How do you mitigate it? How do you remove the risk, reduce basically the black hole sucking resources away that's just stopping you from ever kind of making improvements? How do you contain that? And some simple processes using simple technologies that almost any kind of organization already has or can get very easily. And what can we kind of learn from that? So that's the agenda for today. Rahul or Vic, did you want to kind of make any comments on that before we get into the first part?
I'm good. Vic?
Good. I'm good.
So I really thought about this because this is one of the key things, and Vic, you talked about the need to plan, right? The need to have some situational awareness, and not just kind of run in without that kind of awareness of maybe where the biggest impact can be gained, and particularly when you have limited time, limited resources, and so on. So there are two models that I think are really key from a strategic planning perspective. One is by Simon Wardley. And if you Google Wardley Maps or Wardley Canvas, you should easily find lots of resources on that. That really focuses on where a particular technology lies in its evolution and maturity, all the way from its sort of abstract academic insight to, it's DIY, everyone has to cobble it together themselves. It's fully productized, or it's, completely commoditized and utility. That lends itself again to, what's appropriate to kind of build, buy, borrow, outsource kind of decisions. Even within an application stack, for example, which components you should build, which ones you should buy, which ones you should just use open source, and so on. That's very external facing. And then there's Moore's model. So it's different from Moore's law in terms of CPU computation power and things, but Moore's model really focuses more internally, and it looks at where a particular kind of application or technology is within your company's revenue stream. And, you know, is it something that's sort of the cash cow that's been there forever, but probably doesn't have, you know, too long to live? You know, is it right in the middle of that growth phase, or is it in you know, very future looking, you know, revenues may be some way off, but this is where you're going to get your future growth from. And both of those are really helpful in suggesting management strategies, right? And Moore's model, again, talks very much about different management strategies for those different types of applications that will get the most benefit and kind of manage risk for the organization and allow you to, you know, keep having that internal transformation, that internal innovation to keep rebuilding and reinventing your capabilities as an organization. So while both of those are great, and I highly recommend you look at both of those in more detail, like I said, they're not easy to get a grasp on. So I've tried to synthesize that down to a really quick assessment, a really quick worksheet that you can answer a few simple questions about, you know, the type of application. This kind of goes a little way into the Wardley model. You know, if it's general purpose, it's very likely that all enterprises use this, and this is, you know, highly standardized and available as SaaS or, you know, at least some commercial off-the-shelf offering. Industry specific, again, you know, depending on the size and speciality of your industry, it's likely to have some kind of common solutions, all the way down to really organization specific things that are just so fundamentally tied into how your business operates differently from any other. Maybe it's a unique piece of IP. Maybe it's something you really use to drive a differentiation. And then again, look at where your stakeholders, yourself, your business sees that. You know, is it internal facing? Is it just sort of maintaining current needs, or is it really focused on building future growth? And then looking at different ways of creating, operating, and managing those, and finding stable patterns and combinations of these that kind of lead to, again, you sort of want to be down on that bottom left-hand corner where it's reliable and stable, it takes up minimal resources to operate, and it's meeting user expectations. And, you know, sometimes you're going to end up in the middle where it's getting a good outcome, but it's consuming a lot more resources than you would like. And you really just want to avoid that bottom right-hand corner where it's either really unreliable, receiving frequent you know, complaints, escalations, outages, those kind of things. Or even if it is stable, it's just not meeting user expectations. And you just, again, sometimes got so much technical debt in that you can't, you know, bring new features, new value-added capabilities into it to keep up with what people want. So to give you some idea on how to use this and how to, you know, obviously with the worksheet, we've sort of called out, you know, if you maybe think of your top 5 applications that come to mind, kind of answer for each row, which one of those best describes it. And there's certain kind of stable patterns that are likely to lead to the best outcomes. And I'll call out some that are, you know, probably unstable. And even if they're not causing problems now, might in the future, where you might be able to kind of make shifts proactively. And so if we look at kind of really general purpose enterprise applications, things like, Vic, you mentioned things like payroll, right? Again, it could differ from geography with different tax rules and HR rules and so on, but generally this is something that's very well solved. It's not something that for most organizations, unless you are actually creating that as your customer offering, that you want to be doing in-house. It's something that you would definitely want some kind of SaaS or commercial off-the-shelf solution, or at the very least, even if it's for want of a better word, kind of on-premise type deployment, you know, it's not available as a SaaS solution from the vendor, outsource the operation of that to some other kind of IT service provider. So there's just really no overhead or resources on your part other than that vendor management kind of relationship. And that's where, you know, the user expectations in those kind of areas are typically very stable. They don't change very often. They're well defined. And there's really no value to your organization in self-hosting that typically, right? Again, I don't want to kind of say there's always a right answer here, but this is patterns, right? If you find that you don't quite fit this pattern, it doesn't mean it's a disaster. It doesn't mean that something's fundamentally wrong, but it's probably an area to look and question why you're not following this type of pattern for that type of application.
Ben, just to interrupt you, you know, let's say one has, because this is a question I've actually encountered from an end user, which is that let's say you have an application that has been moved to the cloud, especially if it's a in-house application, and you move that to the cloud, and then there's trouble with the application somewhere down the road. How do you isolate whether, you know, it's, I mean, your cloud provider swears that it's not, you know, it's not their fault, it's not their doing, it's your application that's kind of slow and out of date. So how do you pinpoint the precise reason why it is faltering?
I mean, to be honest, that's a very deep rabbit hole that I don't think you're ever going to get a cookie cutter way of triaging that. I'd say in that circumstance, I would still, even though it might be running on cloud infrastructure, I'd still classify it as that self-hosted, right? You're still operating that. It's not SaaS, you know, it's not platform as a service. It's not, you've outsourced the infrastructure, but you haven't outsourced the operations of the application itself, right? And if you're falling into that very general purpose kind of application, very general purpose kind of use case, again, unless you have very, very clear and explicit constraints on why you need to operate that yourself, that's exactly the type of situation where you want to kind of have SLAs on a service provider, or you want to just be in a SaaS relationship with the software vendor themselves, where those kind of situations, you just don't get into that. And obviously they would have much more kind of authority and sway, you know, in kind of dealing with their own infrastructure providers if there was some kind of, you know, a problem fell between the cracks, you know, of the software vendor and the infrastructure vendor. It's definitely a very difficult situation to manage unless you have huge clout with both the software vendor and the cloud provider to work together to isolate that and kind of prove one way or the other where the issue lies.
Vic, you wanted to say something?
I'm not going to even try and give a default answer to that. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Vic, you're on mute.
No, just trying to. So I think that it comes down to the provider you choose, but it also comes down to what sort of scale and availability you're asking for. Because different providers, and cloud is not a solution for everyone. I always say that, you know, just because it's cloud doesn't mean it's the holy grail and the answer to all the problems. But also the fact that there's a variety, that most of the cloud providers give you that flexibility to scale out or scale up. And obviously when scaling up or out, either way, it's going to cost you a lot of money because nothing's cheap with the resources you get. So, you know, at times you might find a provider that would have promised you, and this is where you have to do your due diligence. This is where your planning again comes into play, that you need to actually experiment and you need to trial out, whoever the provider is, trial out the application in a staging environment, see if it works, so you can handle the load. If not, how much more do you have to spend time and effort and resources and money in order to get to a point where it is actually acceptable? And then you have to sort of, you know, calculate the cost benefit in terms of either you have the application on a public cloud, or you have your own, you set up your own private cloud, or you have it within your own private infrastructure, and whether it's going to be good or bad for you. So it's actually a different scenario for every organization, depending which application you're trying to publish or you're providing to the general public. You know, if it's a high capacity, high availability application that chews a lot of resources, of course it's going to cost you more money on the cloud because they have to allocate more resources towards it. But it's a simple application, like it's just, you know, it's a web-based application that does not do too much number crunching, like it's not accounting software. It's more like a CRM, but it's not heavy duty, like a heavy duty CRM, that would make more sense in that case. So it depends on the situation and the scenario you're trying to use it in. Of course, you can also, yeah.
Sorry.
That's
I think that's a really good example.
I'll let you go.
I think that's a really good example of the point that I'm trying to make here. And in particular, Moore's model, it kind of really addresses this in detail. But if you think about the level of effort, planning, operations, management, all that kind of work you're talking about there, that you need to put into those kind of decisions and operations of an application. If that application is delivering massive direct value to your organization, it's worth it. When it's something, say, like payroll, it's like the plumbing, right? If you do the perfect job, the absolute best possible job of operating that application, no one is going to applaud you or pat you on the back. But the second that is unavailable, you'll be crucified. The level of expectation on that is completely out of proportion, to the value and to the kind of resources that you need to be putting into it. And so that's exactly the type of thing that if you can offload that level of energy and have a specialist providing that, again, whether it's outsourced or SaaS, you're able to manage that risk much better and free up all of that thinking and energy and resources that's basically going into keeping the plumbing running and put it into something that that stakeholders are going to really value and appreciate you kind of giving them more on. And I think that's really Moore's focus. Is it's all about, again, given infinite time, infinite resources, we can all do everything, but in a pragmatic sense, what can you offload and use to manage your risk and manage your resources? So that sort of brings us to I guess the anti-pattern, right? If this was something you were, for example, again, payroll, again, if someone on the line actually works for a payroll provider, it's a little bit different, but for most general enterprises, if you were doing, for example, in-house custom development to actually build, develop and maintain your own payroll software suite, that would be a huge investment in resources for what is a fairly generic use case, where there's plenty off-the-shelf solutions, SaaS solutions available. And your best case outcome is probably that it is reliable and stable and it does meet user expectations, but it consumes a huge amount of resources to maintain. That's your best case outcome, right? And the worst case is you just don't have the resources needed to keep it stable or needed to keep up with user demands, and you flip over into that right-hand column where you end up in trouble. So again, there's no silver bullet or kind of like always right, always wrong kind of approach to this, but it just highlights kind of certain patterns for certain types of applications and achieving certain purposes, particularly if it's just user facing, there's no real customer value or visibility of that solution. There's certain patterns that put you already in a precarious situation that it only takes, one thing to go wrong, and you slide very quickly into that firefighting state. So if we look again at industry specific, so shopping carts for e-commerce providers, hotel reservation software for hotels, things that might not be general purpose across any organization, but typically in your industry, again, are very standard, very common. Again, either internal facing, really around internal users and efficiencies, or something really focused on really just maintaining current existing customers. You hear words like table stakes in these kind of situations, right? This table stakes doesn't make you stand out. again, if your hotel reservation software stops working, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. But if it's working perfectly, no one's going to be, giving you a pat on the back or recommendations. Again, this is a really good situation to look at outsourcing or consuming kind of SaaS versions, at least commercial off-the-shelf kind of solutions. Even if it's in a custom application, this could be an off-the-shelf component, right? And not, again, a hotel might really want to differentiate on their mobile application and their primary web estate. So they want to have that custom in-house. But would you be building your own billing engine and reservation engine? That's probably much more open to question. And again, you're really trying to end up in, you've got reliability and stability around that application or that component with minimal resources going into it. And you're just kind of meeting user expectations. Nothing here is trying to blow people out of the water, really wow them. It's just trying to work and be efficient. So there's sort of similarities there, which is really looking at things where this problem has been well solved in a general way. There are specialist providers and vendors who are able to build and operate this for you. And even though it might seem like the upfront or kind of dollar value is larger, what you're really looking for here is to offload the resourcing, offload the energy, time, planning, skills, all those kind of things so that you can focus them elsewhere. Again, a potential anti-pattern, outsourcing this, to some kind of, it's a custom development organization, and having them kind of build this for you, or self-hosting, the off-the-shelf version of this, areas where, again, probably best case, you get good user expectations or user feedback, they're reliable and stable, but the amount of resources, both in vendor management or operations and cost, could sort of exceed the value that your organization's getting out of that, or at least be out of proportion to the value that you're delivering. And again, it only takes kind of one thing to go wrong, end up in some kind of situation with it where you've got a huge change cost or very long lead time on changes with that outsourced provider to fix something, or you end up with a lot of your resources firefighting basic operational issues with that are really just trying to put out fires. So again, this is not saying outsourced kind of software projects are always wrong. It's certainly not saying self-hosting things is always wrong, but you have to be, this is kind of a red flag where you want to really be able to justify to yourself that the benefits and payoffs of that are in line with what stakeholders and the rest of the business believe the value of that is providing, and how to mitigate the risk of sliding into that danger zone over to the right.
Vic, I just wanted to quickly bring him in. I'm sure you guys have industry-specific, solution that you guys have for FSI. How do you is your experience similar to what Ben has said? And how do you manage your core applications? Is it a cloud affair? Is it a hybrid affair?
See, we've got a mixture. So we've got our own private cloud. So we've got a mixture architecture, so to speak. We've got a private cloud. We use public cloud for certain applications, predominantly for applications that are not transaction sensitive. So they're not actually processing transactions, but they're more like a brochure, websites, or systems that can be used in a staging and trial environment. And we use a hybrid solution as well for a lot of our systems, but predominantly we rely on a private cloud just because of matter of security. With the financial services organization, you want to make sure there's a lot of data that's highly private and sort of secure, and you have to there's a lot of privacy concerns and there's custom information, so we need to make sure that you need to make it as secure as possible. So we try to offset a lot of that secure environment in our own private cloud, but we use hybrid cloud for other applications like email archiving, co-location of services with our load balancers, stuff like that. So we use those sort of non-highly secure applications on the cloud so we can have the robustness of the cloud. But obviously most of the applications we use for our FSI are built in-house. They're web-based, they're easily accessible from a browser. And so we can easily open them up to the internet, which is what most of them were. And a lot of them were open during the start of the pandemic. But I find that if you have a mixture of cloud technologies, or if you have a mixture of infrastructure where you have your own private cloud, you can hybrid into the public cloud. At the same time, you utilize the best of both worlds. It works out really well in our situation, of course. But if you're only stuck to one technology or one infrastructure, then you're pretty much within the confines of that infrastructure, and you can't easily move out of that infrastructure, or take it longer to move out of it. So I think it's always good to have that sort of backup environment where you can actually move your infrastructure if need be. If something goes wrong, there's a disaster recovery. Obviously, DR planning is part of every IT manager's a job position. That's a job description to have a DR plan, but also part of the DR plan to have that high availability in a different environment. So I think for us, it works well where we use the mixture of the environments itself. So we can use the public cloud where we can put less secure systems that can also leverage or point towards the private cloud where we need to use security infrastructure or load balancers or remote connectivity or things like that to offload at certain time periods. Also using cloud bursting at the same time when it's required.
Excellent. Back to you, Ben.
No, that's great. And I think that kind of shows too, like you need to take this through the lens, like the way I've kind of mapped this out is more from a kind of end user perspective. If, for example, you are a specialist provider, again, maybe you work for a company that does build and sell payroll software, right? Well, in that case, that's an organization specific application. That's part of your IP. It directly provides customer facing value. It's not like an internal facing solution. So these are just meant to be hints or suggestions that are broadly applicable, but you need to try and look at this through your own lens. Again, we just mentioned kind of FSI. Let's say there's a trading platform, hedge fund, banks, anyone with a kind of trading platform, there could be highly proprietary algorithms and kind of mechanisms in that. This is something you have to build yourself. There's no way to kind of operate that type of business and consume a general offering. Or again, maybe it's very bleeding edge focused in the kind of future of your industry. And there's just no one doing this yet. There's no standard solutions to this problem. And this is how you're kind of creating IP, creating kind of strategic value as an organization. This is where in-house custom development is going to be really the only mechanism for you. Again, there could be off-the-shelf components composed together for that. Fantastic, but you're going to have to drive that. And really the point of trying to move those other solutions off into other management styles and techniques is to allow you to focus where it really matters, on those things that make your organization special, and in particular, make it special to customers, to people who you rely on for revenue. Right? So that you can focus not just your development skills, but your operational resources on making sure that those are as reliable and stable as possible. They're keeping up with user expectations. You're never going to get a point where these are very minimal to build and operate. They're always going to take up a lot of resources because they're so essential to what you're doing. And also, particularly if they're future focused, because there's so much work to do to constantly kind of keep up with shifting user expectations and demands. So again, this is trying to be very pragmatic. It's, you can always find an exception to the rule for those other patterns and anti-patterns, but it's really saying if you are finding yourself unable to put the resources you need into these very strategic, high value, essential kind of customer facing applications, the only way you can free that up without a lot of extra people, extra money, extra technology is to make some trade-offs. And so it's really about showing where should those trade-offs be made to best manage the risk. Because again, there's never going to be zero risk in any of these decisions. Anything that we're doing is going to carry risk, so that you can focus here where, you know, this is going to directly impact, you know, top line, bottom line revenue. You know, stakeholders like your executive suite can draw a direct line between effort and improvements here and business outcomes. It puts, you know, this is what's really going to drive that reputation for your IT organization within the wider executive team and stakeholders. This is the stuff that goes from just being kind of plumbing and table stakes to being supporting the business excel. And this is where you want to be really shining, and you want as much of your available people and technology and time and energy going into making this excellent. And that's, again, where there's a really big red flag around outsourcing this. So again, maybe you want to outsource certain components, certain very tightly scoped kind of parts of this. But if this is something that is so strategically crucial to your line of business or to your organization as a whole, to be dependent on that outsourcing organization for them to be potential blockers to that is very risky, and the vendor management and due diligence and things on that, you know, has to be watertight. And again, you have to have a lot of clout that you're able to really have the dominant position in that relationship. Otherwise, it really puts you again at a very risky and unstable kind of position. So that'd be another thing, you know, be really looking at carefully, you know, if you find yourself in this position, making sure that you can really justify why that outsourcing is necessary, and what you're doing to mitigate that risk, you know, if that vendor is not performing.
Vic, you wanted to say something? Yeah, especially on the outsourced versus insourced thing.
I actually, I'm a heavy believer in sourcing rather than outsourcing. I mean, in terms of actual systems development and application development, I definitely think it's worked out in our best interest. But again, everyone's in a different position and situation. In our case, it works better because you've got the flexibility. We own the code. We know what the software is. We can change it anytime we want. We don't have to rely on people. One of the things we did notice, for example, software that we don't own in-house, it's outsourced software. We had a lot of time. We struggled a lot connecting with the people who actually owned it during the pandemic. There's a lot of countries where they were supporting the software that shut down, and their people were working from home. They had really bad internet connections. The support levels were really low. The quality was pretty bad. Sometimes you couldn't even get hold of them. Whereas the applications that we built, you know, during the pandemic, it was so seamless. Like, we made so many changes. We reiterated the application so many times. We published new versions of applications so many times during the pandemic, and it was so seamless for us to do that. One of the things that I would like to mention, and Ben pretty much touched on it here and there, is any solution you look at, whether it's cloud, whether it's in-house, whether it's outsourcing, they all rely heavily on another component, which is the security part of it. That is very, very important. Like, of course, the more you expose yourself to outsourcing or to cloud, the higher security levels you need to maintain than if you were in-house. You still need security, doesn't matter. You still need to protect the internal environment from external. But don't forget, like, as soon as you start going out, you go towards the word cloud, you go towards the word outsource, you're trying to not phase your liability to the outsource, the cloud provider, because they have serious clause there that they can be exempted from. It's your responsibility at the end of the day. It doesn't matter if you put your data or your infrastructure in their environment. It's your responsibility. A lot of people forget about that, but people don't read the fine print or don't think about it. A lot of people in the past, even like, and I think Ben and yourself, Rahul, have heard this as well. They think if you give it to the cloud, it's their problem. No, it's not. It's not the cloud's problem.
It's a good point. I mean, there's operational risk, and I've been saying risk a bit in the last few minutes. There's operational risk that you can offload, right? That if there's a problem, they got to put their people on it, right?
Yeah.
But regulatory and compliance risk, you can
Yeah.
never outsource. And
No.
that's a really key distinction. That's always on you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Breach of data, anything got leaked, anybody had the password to the SaaS environment, the virtual environment, that's your problem. That's not ours. If there's a problem with the memory leak or hardware, yeah, we'll sort it out. But a lot of people, Ben, I think don't realize they're still under the illusion that if you move your stuff from in-house or your infrastructure or your applications, you move to the cloud provider, it's their responsibility. No, it's not. And that's why when you said that, there's a lot, especially points where you focused on outsourcing the cloud and the risk and the responsibilities. And, you know, you have to have very tight sort of contracts set in place, and you've got to make sure you've maintained it, you've done the right thing, you put your firewalls in place, you put your load balancers in place, you've done everything right as much as you can mitigate the risk. Because as you said, nothing's 100%, nothing will be ever 100% secure. That's the wrong, anybody who says that is lying. There's no such thing as 100% secure. So all you can do is mitigate the risk as far as you can.
Yeah, no, I think that was a good distinction, because I probably wasn't being explicit enough when I said risk, what type of risk too. So thanks for that, Vic. And I guess that kind of puts us, because I'm just looking at time, Rahul, you'll have to prompt me if I'm sliding on this last bit. But I think these concepts in this last bit, I really tried to make this, you know, effective, because they're quite simple concepts that you can take back to your teams and start driving from a process. So it shouldn't take us too long to go through them. I think they're fairly simple, but they're powerful, right?
Yeah, sorry, Ben. I was just gonna let you know that we have we have a grand total of 12 minutes left.
I can make it.
Yeah.
I can make
so
it.
We have about 7 minutes left. So if you could just, you know, I think we can extend the session just a little bit because we have a couple of questions. But if you could just wrap that up in about 7 minutes or so, that would be perfect.
Sure. And then I think, again, people can always reach out or ask questions if we went too fast. So I guess, okay, so you've done your assessments. You've got some kind of situational awareness. Again, this is just meant to really focus, where should I focus my energy? Which applications seem to be in the right kind of place and state? I can put them over to the side. These are the kind of, you know, worst offenders or problem children. And obviously the worst case is if you've got any kind of applications, no matter what type they are, what their purpose is, you know, where they're hitting that bottom right-hand corner, frequent complaints, escalations, incidents, users, you know, just not being able to keep up with user demands and things like that. So once you're there, that's a really big resource commitment just to put those fires out. So I think one of the big mindsets that comes out of like lean management practices, and again, in the context of IT, comes under the heading of kind of DevOps principles and things like that. Again, whether that term is kind of meaningful for you or not, doesn't really matter. The fundamental thing is that if you are trying to reach higher levels of velocity in terms of the amount of impact, the amount of change you can deliver to your organization, without stability, you can never reach that. It's, you know, you can reach it for a short period of time, but as soon as one of these fires break out, everything comes crashing to a halt. That's what people would have seen when the pandemic first broke out, their velocity in terms of impact, valuable impact, right, would have just vanished almost overnight, with everything focused on kind of bringing stability to the systems and having people up and running. So if you don't have stability, any kind of form of progress or velocity is just at best an illusion or a kind of short-term trend. You can't have stability without availability, and availability in a broad sense. Security matters. If you're being DDoSed, if you're having data breaches, if you're having ransomware, right? That might be classified as security, but the impact of that is lack of availability of that application. So you really need to focus on availability. So really often, or almost always, we're tracking ourselves by mean time to failure and mean time to recover. Failures can be really complex to remove from a system. Avoiding failures is essentially impossible. You will always have some. But recovery can be made very, very simple and very, very fast. and totally irrespective of the type of failure. And this is where you can get the most value. So if we focus where those fires are in that incident response phase, right? If you can make some simple changes in how you kind of deploy and operate your applications, you can dramatically reduce your mean time to recover, which means even when you do hit those inevitable problems, you can mitigate them from a user perspective very, very quickly. That takes away a huge amount of energy and resources going into getting things back on track. And then you can reinvest that into moving up that chain where you're actually removing the failures at source, right? But that comes next. That's a secondary kind of phase. So everything's about how do we do that? Now, a really large percentage, like anywhere between 80 and 90%, depending on the organization and the survey that you look at, 80 to 90% of outages are caused by bad changes. Things that the IT group or application group deliberately did, but had a negative impact, right? An unexpected consequence. So controlling your deployments and controlling changes is key to this. Now, when you look at everything that can happen, you know, again, looking at, say, an in-house application, everything from the time of development, you know, all the way through to getting it into production and getting it to customers, there's all types of teams and handoffs and all types of things. And again, lean operations, DevOps are trying to kind of break down friction in those barriers, right? Or even the latest kind of ITIL 3 kind of concepts are all focused on that. So I really want to focus on your network team and how network infrastructure participates in the deployment of an application, because often network administrators are purely there to provision an IP, put a load balancer in front of it, open the firewall ports, and then they're never spoken to ever again. And when an application team is actually doing a deployment or a change, the network team's not necessarily involved or informed, and they're certainly not used proactively to help mitigate the risk of that application team making an error. So it's really about bringing the network infrastructure into that change process, into that deployment process, and using technologies like load balancing or global site load balancing. Again, completely vendor agnostic. It doesn't matter what vendor you have here. They're generally have these fundamental capabilities. And looking at the sense that any progress you're trying to make requires some change. Every time you make a change, you have to treat that as a deployment. That doesn't mean that you're upgrading the application to a new version. It could just be a setting change on the application or the underlying infrastructure. And every time you do that, you risk availability. If that goes wrong, you have a risk that you need to mitigate. And there's some controlled deployment patterns you can use that do that. So by having, for example, just server load balancing in front of your application pool, it allows you to use something like a blue-green deployment pattern. So this would involve, rather than doing in-place changes to those servers, building a whole new server pool. The only difference between is the version of the application or the version of the change or the configuration. And then switching at a load balancer level, switching between those pools. So you're redirecting users to one or the other. If you have everything working, you just switch off the old pool. Again, maybe a day later, an unforeseen problem, again, maybe you did it in the middle of the night, everyone comes in the morning, starts using it, performance is terrible, it's unusable. You still have that other server pool, you can switch that back on, switch users over to that, and troubleshoot the issue without users being on that new version, right? So this gives you essentially instantaneous ability to flick users away from a failing version or configuration back to the previous. You've got instant rollback here. And again, maybe that goes away, you never resolve it, and you try again with version 1.2 or whatever that is, right? So this is a really important pattern. The other pattern is canary deployments. And this really requires less state-based applications. It needs to be modern applications, particularly modern web applications and in-house applications you control. But this is really about using a pattern where you make changes one by one within a pool, and you have a certain percentage of users using that new version and others still directing to the older version. And this is particularly good for finding performance issues. So you can slowly stagger this up and up and see how well does that new configuration scale. Maybe there's a new feature, you're doing some kind of A/B testing as well. This allows you to kind of gradually do that, and likewise roll that back and revert each of that server pool to back to the previous state. And then that pattern can be repeated with global site load balancing, which operates at a DNS level. That can be repeated at a site level. You can upgrade an entire data center or cloud region, see how that performs, see if that is getting the right user experience and operating properly before rolling that out to other sites. And again, if at any point you find problems, you can use that to redirect everybody to the known good version and roll those sites back. So this operates at both a site level using server load balancing, the server level, and at a site level using GSLB. What this means is that, rather than having, in place, risky, stressful mitigation strategies, trying to resolve issues while users are complaining or applications are downward, you're going to make even more mistakes. It allows you to quickly return service to users and then in a planned, methodical way, find out what went wrong, but without all of that pressure, without the escalations. And that allows you to free up all of that time and energy to bring more stability and reduce failures in the systems. So these are some really simple deployment patterns that if you can think about, every single change is a deployment. And every single deployment can be done in a controlled fashion that allows almost instantaneous reversion and rollback for users. You bring much more stability and much more control, and your mean time to recovery comes down to, at least minutes, if not seconds, depending how quickly you can detect issues. And it just gives you so much more control over what's happening with your teams. Last couple of points is make sure if you're trying to implement these things, you measure change, try it in one team or one application, measure the change in outages, measure the change in availability and your metrics so you can really prove that this is showing value. Because again, people don't always like change. It might be hard to justify why you're doing things differently. You need different silos to start talking to each other, different functional groups. Not everyone's going to be happy about that. They might be unsure about it. Make sure you can really show the value that you're bringing. And also try to communicate that in value to the business for your stakeholders. And that can help you get support for broader changes, reinvestment in your group, reinvestment in certain technologies if you do need to, if you don't have GSLB, for example, or you need more load balancing. And that can really help you, bring that stakeholder engagement to another level by showing how that has allowed the company to save money, save downtime, increase revenue. And then I have a lot more of these kind of concepts in detail in my book because obviously we do have very limited time, but I hope there's enough there that people can kind of go back and think about their teams, their applications, and get something from it that's actionable for them. And yeah, reach out to us at Kemp. I'm on LinkedIn, Twitter, all of those things. Please reach out and find us.
Excellent. I think, Ben, if you could actually just put the email, because I think you just closed the slides. If you could just
sorry, let's just bring it back.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, no, you can just put in the, you can just, I think for those who want to reach out, there's so much to, I have a billion questions for Ben myself, and I'm very sure that the audience, we have a couple of questions from the audience, which we'll get to, but if you guys have any questions, you can reach out to apecmarketing@kemp.ax. And I think, Ben, we are giving away, Kemp is giving away 5 copies of the book.
Yeah.
Of your book.
My marketing manager, Kay, will kill me for that. Yeah, I think that's right.
So
the first 5 to ask for it.
It's actually, I have it with me right here. And I gotta say that it's one of the very few IT books I've read cover to cover in a long time. So it is readable and it's pretty thin, so it's quite easy to get through.
And I launched it the week before lockdown, and then nobody paid attention, so that was a great time.
Lovely. I think there's an Amazon link as well for that.
It is on Amazon, yeah.
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 But I think the first 5 people who email will be able to will be getting the book for free. So go ahead with that. And so we have a couple of questions. I know we are way past time, but I would really like Vic to address especially these couple of questions, which is, putting aside a typical example of when an application goes down and the remedial steps IT needs to take to both diagnose and then rectify the problem. I think you have tons of experience with this. Go ahead, Vic.
Well, hope not. I don't have tons of experience. That actually doesn't sound good at all. But no, it can happen to anyone. And you know what? It's a good example. I'll give you one, which is very close to something that Ben was talking about today. So we use a load balancer. I won't name which one, but we use a load balancer where we try to deploy applications to multiple web servers, and the load balancer offloads those web servers. And a couple of weeks ago, we realized when we did a deployment, one of the programmers forgot to check a piece of code in, which happens sometimes. Even though it went to the test phase, it was tested. In the last minute, somebody checked it out and checked it, all that sort of jazz. Anyway, I won't get into detail. So what happened, they deployed the application to one of the servers. So we offloaded one of the servers from the load balancer and pointed the DNS, internal DNS, to look at the new server where the new code changes were made. In Ben's case, API version 2. And straight away we realized as soon as we logged in the application, there was an error in a particular area where we knew that that error was actually fixed. Now, the good thing is, because we planned these things, and again, I keep coming back to planning, because we planned it that we're going to test one server, take it off the production environment, test it as if it was a production, but only internally, we were able to save our bacon because the application was still up and running as a public site, and the users and our brokers and our customers were able to log on to it seamlessly. Nothing went down exactly. All we had to do is push one button to take that very server out of the equation and to fix the issue very quickly. And once we were done, obviously, we rectified the issue, put it back into the environment. Again, it was very seamless to deploy that same application across multiple servers. Now, there's also scenarios where, there can always things can always go wrong. As I said before, nothing's 100%. Nothing ever will be 100% perfect or secure. But, you got to have a plan. You got to think on your feet very quick. Again, comes down to planning, your strategy, your DR procedures and planning, the way you look at plan B, C, D. A lot of things have to be decided at the point in time. But for me, a worst case scenario would be when we had an issue with a financial system where the transaction counts were calculating correctly for interest calculations. I knew at that point in time, either we could actually bring the application offline for a couple of hours and fix the issue. We figured out very quickly what the issue was in the staging environment, obviously, but it was a choice between either we put a quick fix right now, doing procedures I told you by bringing one application, one server down at a time, and then doing a quick fix, or we can spend another 10 hours or 2 days putting a proper patch. So from my perspective, a quick fix always wins because you can at least get the application back up and running and doing what it's supposed to do. And then obviously you've got to work towards the proper solution. But again, these things can be mitigated. If you had, for example, if I didn't have a load balancer in front of my production web-based environment, and we've got a few, if I don't have a load balancer or firewall, anything security-wise is open. I don't have that. I don't have high availability, which is what I'm trying to get at. The high availability, I didn't scale those applications. I'll be stuck with one machine, one server, and one application, one server, which means that anything happens to that application, that's it. Either you fix that or you have to let it go down for a couple of hours or days or whatever the case is. So I think the key is whatever you do, whichever way, it doesn't matter if it's infrastructure-wise, doesn't matter systems-wise, doesn't matter if it's security-wise, whatever, firewalls, load balancers, just make sure it's highly available. Always make sure you got high availability because that's very important, especially right now with the pandemic, because you don't even know the size that you have in Melbourne, for example, which is, it's getting plastered at the moment with internet data because a lot of people working from home. So it might be that, the links might be slow, the speeds might be slow, the servers, can't handle the the bandwidth that it's getting. So you can always offload that switcher over seamlessly to a place like Sydney or WA when there's, there's people who can go back to work, or your infrastructure is still pretty stable out there at the moment. It's not getting hammered because people are outside the house, they're not all in the house, confined to it. So I think the key always is to make sure you've got high availability and you've got scalable applications.
Brilliant. We have one more question, but I think we are just way out of time. We are about 10, 15 minutes out of over time. And yet another question has come in. So I think this one we can take offline. We will, yeah, I mean, it's just too many questions. But anyway, so thanks everyone. Thanks for attending. Thank you so much, Ben and Vic. We have a feedback form that we have put in the chat. So please, your feedback is going to be very valuable. And I think, considering the nature of the conversation today, I think we could easily have another follow-up webinar as well, and a further deep dive into some of the points that were left unaddressed. So thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, and have a very pleasant afternoon or morning, wherever you may be. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Final words, Ben and Vic.
I just wanted to say to Fernando, who just put in the question there, I have copied and pasted it, and I'll try to respond to that. I'll find his registration information and try and get a response to him.
Excellent. Vic, final thoughts?
Great
very
chat.
Final?
Appreciated it.
Excellent.
I appreciate it, guys. Thank you very much. It was really good.
Thank you. Thanks all. Have a good day.
You too, Matt. Stay safe.
Take care.
See you guys.
Bye.